Welcome to
In at the End.
episode 4.
Episode 4.
Meadowlands. Let's talk about it. I don't know.
We're going to talk about it.
Where do you want to start?
Well, I believe there's some themes that start to be introduced. Let's start with the dream sequence.
Okay.
That's something that happens right off the top of this episode and becomes such a key part of The Sopranos. I think it's interesting to see how it starts. So what are your thoughts?
Well, this is probably not the main idea, but I feel like he often has dreams when he's sleeping at arenas.
That didn't cross my mind.
I think a later dream
Okay.
with the fish
Right.
also happens at her house, and I feel like there's another one even. I want to keep tracking that,
Okay. Yeah. That's a good thing
but
to
it's
look
kind
out
of
for.
besides the point.
I think one thing that this show does that's really fascinating is that I feel like plot development points happen within the dreams, which is such a kind of different way of approaching development from a writing angle. I think typically we're so used to kind of being hammered over the head with what's about to happen and how it happens, but in the show it always kind of unfolds through this subconscious way. It's crazy. And I think, so for instance, in this example, we kind of see Jackie being sick and the fear of Jackie dying, and then Jackie does die in this episode. And that's something that the show does later on too. We have these kind of major pivotal moments in the development of the story happen through these kind of subconscious means.
Right. Well, we don't in the end, like, we're not there when Jackie does die, right? Even
Right.
though they're there earlier in the day or,
Yeah.
or the day before, I guess.
Yeah.
We're not actually
Which
there.
we're not there for.
And so we live that through the dream sequence in some ways.
And that too, I think that does play into this. It's so interesting in this show how nothing's really obvious. Everything kind of happens. You have so many important things happening off screen. It's a very kind of unique approach to unfolding a story. It's very anticlimactic.
Yeah, maybe we'll come back to that after. I want to just go back to the dream sequence thing. I think it's interesting, the framing of this show, like the fact that they use dreams so much, because there is this focus on, psychiatry or psychology, if you want to put it there, right? Which, in a Freudian way, focuses a lot on dreams, puts a lot of emphasis on dreams. So I think it's interesting that that's kind of also a frame for this show, to a lesser degree as we get later into the seasons, right? But certainly in this first season, we start to get that Chase and the rest of the team are really interested in people's subconscious, and they're interested in people's underlying psyche. And I guess we start to see that with this first dream sequence.
Yeah.
I love the reflection. I love that we really focus on Melfi's legs. It's kind of reflective of the first scene of the first episode where we have the
Right.
legs of the statue.
Right.
I like that it's then reflected later on where she, in their actual session where she's pulling down her
At the
skirt
end.
a little bit at the end. Yep.
Well, that's interesting too, because, and we'll get there perhaps later, but there is definitely kind of this bookending of the episode with Melfi's legs and kind of this, it's kind of somewhat sexualized in terms of her character and the way that she comes across in the dream, but then also in the end of the episode. And something that I thought was interesting is that in some ways Tony's in control in his dream, but he's also in that last session of the episode, he's somewhat in control in terms of the topic kind of comes to this casual violence, and all of a sudden he's not so much
He's
the
like
one
an
who's
expert in that.
he's an expert, and you can
Yeah.
see it in his body language and her body
Totally.
language. He actually kind of takes control of that session. He's actually the one who's kind of leading it.
I love the way he kind of leans back into the chair to listen to her. It's really great.
Yeah. No, totally.
There's some other, maybe just to focus on the therapy sessions. We don't often talk about them as a unit kind of in themselves because they're so interspersed through the episodes, and some episodes we have very few. But Carmela made some interesting comments on therapy today when she and Tony were discussing his therapy, right? It's the first time we hear that she, misrefers to his therapist as a man, which is comes back later. But she also has some great lines. Like she says, if the therapy didn't hurt, it wouldn't be helping.
Right.
In terms of his coping. Tony references, we see Tony actually listening a lot to Melfi's advice, right? He gets that elder book, even though he says, I'm not going to have time to read a book.
Right.
And so we see, and then we see how this is impacting a lot of his choices that he's making by listening to Melfi and by having his great ideas that he has in therapy.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, totally. I thought in the dream it was interesting. Some of the things that we're seeing again, there's a painting behind Syl as he kind of enters that waiting room of nature again. Also, I was surprised, something that caught me immediately in the very first scene when he sees Melfi is that kind of bright backdrop through the window.
Yeah.
And I was actually thinking, well, that's odd because I remember remarking in one of the earlier episodes that we saw the nature behind her. So it's interesting how they control that and make a choice of what you see. But later on, obviously, you see Hesh walking through the wilderness
and it's
behind
so dreamlike, yeah.
And then it's very clear that we're in a dream. There's actually something that was kind of striking me immediately just by that decision.
That's interesting. We talked about that a little bit in last week's.
There's definitely a focus on nature, both in the paintings and outside, and what we're seeing. And again, I feel like that's kind of this representation of the eternal. And when we start to tie in Jackie, it's him reflecting on mortality and him reflecting on Jackie's life and how that's clearly something that he's dealing with and thinking about at that time.
We also see him go to a gardening shop, right?
Yeah.
Jeremy's dad's flower shop.
Yeah.
But the scene we kind of get a lead in there is him going, he has some kind of bug problem and he's looking to kill them.
Yeah.
And the guy offers him, it's like hits you pretty over the head with it, but the guy's like, I have this blue product, I have this product and it's bio friendly or like environmentally friendly, and he was like, I don't want that.
I want DDT.
Yeah, and the guy's like, that's illegal or whatever he says, but that's also in terms of Tony's control over nature, right? That's kind of how he
and also the toxicness of his approach to dealing with things.
Yeah, that it kills other things around him. Right?
Yeah. And that's interesting. I think that this episode starts to introduce the aspect of collateral damage. I think we really start to see that in a couple different instances of Tony's actions. If we follow them and see the impact, it's really impacting other people in a negative way. So we have, for instance, while he's at the flower shop, we see Jeremy's dad. And I thought it was really interesting the way that those two characters are set up. Tony's kind of seeming dominant. He's holding this hatchet, which is clearly scaring him. He's wearing a pink shirt, which there seemed to be this kind of like emasculating aspect to him talking to Tony. Yeah. In that Tony was in control, even though Tony was trying to have a normal relationship.
Yeah, like a dad to dad
be
thing.
Friendly.
Yeah.
That can't exist because of the undercurrent of the situation. Also, of course, him employing Vin Makazian to go after Dr. Melfi and her partner, her boyfriend, who becomes completely emasculated by the end, and becomes a shell of his former self, can't really operate within his own life, and we really start to see that Tony's actions and decisions really have this kind of toxic negative effect on the people.
We see the effect on AJ, right? Like that it impacts him at school, which is an environment that you wouldn't relate to Tony and the mob, right? Like that shouldn't have an impact on it, but it obviously does.
Right. Right. And I feel like the events that are unfolding at the school are kind of this reflection of Tony's life, which is interesting to think about the generational aspect of this show and to think about how things could be repeating themselves in the new generation. So we see this power struggle between Corrado and Tony, and to a lesser extent, we see this power struggle between AJ and Jeremy.
Right.
This kind of high school, childlike, immature kind of conflict that they're having. But I think that the episode is definitely trying to connect them, and there's definitely a relationship between those two.
I want to go back, we were talking about being emasculated, and I think that's obviously, we were talking a little bit about gender in our last episode. But the fact that that's such a big topic, right? Like being a man and what kind of it is to be a man. But we see times when Tony's in these like clearly feminine spaces. Like you commented on it when he was visiting Livia. And there was behind him this painting of a group of women all in a circle. She was sitting on, like, the furniture was just very ornate and feminine, not like when we see him in even like his house is quite masculine. Like the furniture in his house is big and kind of commandeering.
Right.
We see him at the Bing a couple times in this episode,
Right.
but then we see him in this clearly feminine space, and he sometimes looks very small and like
Right.
diminutive in
And
a lot of ways.
in terms of, and we've said this before, but with Tony's character, if you look at the kind of pyramid of power that exists within the mob and that this kind of paradigm that he exists in, he's kind of beholden to his mother. Like, she's the one who has power over him. And we really see that play out. And more of this viewing, I'm really feeling Livia's deliberate actions and her power and the way that she manipulates
Totally.
people.
Totally.
I feel like every time I've seen it, it becomes more and more apparent how aware she is of that. And maybe that is Tony's uncomfort in that environment, and the fact that that painting behind them, which I think now we can see kind of a history of examples of this show using paintings, especially with the empty chair that was such a pivotal part in the previous episode. We can really tell that that is an important device in this show to communicate something. And I think that's definitely very deliberate in that scene.
Totally. And we also see that Livia is really the only person who does have control over Tony. I think we've said this before. But even when, in his first encounter with Junior in this episode, I forget the lead up to it, but basically the first thing Junior, like Tony says he's coming there with respect or something like that. And he was like, respect? You put your mother in a home and leave her out to pasture? Like, for Junior, disrespecting your mom, right, or that relationship with his mom is like a sign of a character deficiency, right? Like, if you do that, then you're not a respectful character.
Right.
And so I don't know, like generationally, if those relationships are changing or different, right? We see lots of instances where Meadow and AJ are super shitty to Carmela.
Right.
We don't see that level of respect there at all. Tony actually does respect, like, he treats her actually with...
It's almost like those principles get gradually worse and worse by generation.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting in this show and this episode in particular where we can really clearly see the attitudes of 3 different generations operating at the same time. Each with their own conflicts and dealing with them in different ways, and seeing how perhaps through the actions of all these characters, how that impacts their offspring, but seeing how over time those principles and those values do get watered down and do become less important. I loved in that scene at Green Grove, the little power struggle over the macaroons.
Yeah.
I find it super interesting. Also, I mean, I love the acting.
Yeah.
Seeing, Livia's face kind of light up, and, seeing them, we are obviously in on the secret that this is kind of her favorite thing, and then shutting down on it, kind of choosing to not.
Well, it was
not engage.
childish, right? And that's the thing. And Junior was childish. And so I love how Melfi uses that example then when she recommends that elder book.
Elder Care, I think.
Elder Care book,
which is reading
right?
at the Bing later.
Yeah, but she says, like, it's what she says is important is letting people feel like they're in control. She's referring to children. But both Livia and Junior often act like babies. They act like little brats sometimes.
Well, they all do.
They all do. Sure.
I thought it was interesting, too, thinking of the macaroons kind of demonstrating the power struggles that exist in the show, seeing something so mundane and small representing something so much larger. Actually kind of reminded me of Phantom Thread, the amazing P.T. Anderson movie that came out recently. But, looking at things on this kind of small scale to kind of sum up these power struggles is super interesting. And I think that the show does a great job. And I think that for a show like this that seemingly has such a large and ambitious scale of this kind of mob story, and it's constantly focusing on these little details, I think there's so much going on within the little details that are actually summing up what's happening.
Even that there's like one macaroon that's kind of off the plate, right?
Yeah.
He like shakes them onto the plate, and there's one that's just not on the plate, and he doesn't even fix it, right? He just leaves it that way.
I wonder,
that part.
He does say, he talks to her about how she doesn't interact with the other ladies, and you have this group behind her of this kind of circle of ladies. I don't know. I wonder if maybe it has something to do with her. Same way that we saw kind of Chris isolated from the group in the first episode.
Yeah, but then we see her, like, she and Rosalie at the funeral at the end, we're all over the place, but she and Rosalie at the end are on either side of Junior, on either side of Corrado. And so I find that interesting because clearly they are extremely important.
Extremely
right?
important. And that did strike me. You see her really at the center of things. And yet the conversation that they're having on the side, Tony, we get that power pyramid is now kind of being manipulated by Tony for his own ends. Mm-hmm. So he's kind of maintaining the image of that power structure, but manipulating it in his own way so that he actually maintains the bulk of the power.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting because for optics, it really does seem like they're at the center and the height of the pyramid.
And we see that by the photographers focusing in that direction,
too.
Yeah.
And yet, at the end of this, it's being suggested that that's actually kind of breaking down.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to go back really quickly to just women and Livia and Rosalie, we also see in that scene, although, yes, they're focused on and they're clearly people of importance, it's Rosalie April's husband's funeral, and everyone's coming over and shaking hands with Junior.
Right.
Right? So it's like a tool.
Right.
Which made me sad for her. And we get to know Rosalie more later. But
yeah, and the focus isn't on her, at least as a viewer.
Or him, really. On Jackie.
It's actually really the way that scene is set up. At least my focus was kind of drawn to Junior at the center with Livia next to him.
Yeah.
They kind of seem almost like a power couple.
Almost like a couple,
sorts.
for sure.
And I guess that does play into, I feel like Livia is playing this game. She is involved in this game, and she is a part of this power dynamic.
Well, then there's so many things in this show that are, like, we don't see, right? We skip in time quite a bit. So I'm always wondering, like, how did she get there to the funeral, right? Who picked her up and brought her there? Did Junior pick her up and bring her there? So I love those little, like, clearly she was an important person to have there. Right? And so that's interesting. And maybe that explains why, Junior's so affronted by the fact that Tony has put her there.
Yeah.
Or placed her there. I don't know what is preferable, mind you.
Yeah.
But.
One thing I found really interesting about the scene with Livia in the home is that right before that, we have the scene where Christopher and Adriana pick up Meadow at the school, and he's kind of shaking her down, and she says, I hate being a soprano, I hate my life. And he says, that's blasphemy. Don't ever say that. So immediately we're given a window into Chris, who's all over the place right now. He's this kind of self-destructive character and this kind of crazy guy. He does hold that principle very dear. He does value life, and that's off limits for him. And then when we transfer to the home, all Olivia does is complain about her life.
Yeah.
She just complains about life. So clearly there's been a disconnect somewhere, generationally, in terms of that value of life. She's lost that. But I just thought that it was fascinating because that really differentiates those two characters. And I think Tony, too. We do see that he does value life. We see later in the show that is something that's very important to him and something that differentiates himself from his mother.
Yeah. There's a lot of moments we see Tony in this episode. I feel like there's a lot to talk about, even though I don't have a lot of notes today. I don't know about you.
Well, there always is a lot to talk about with this.
But we see a lot of scenes of Tony in this episode where, it's like you just really not empathize necessarily, but you really just like him. Like the smile that he gives to AJ at the funeral, the picture of AJ and his dad that's on AJ's mantelpiece. When they play Nintendo, there's like a couple of these moments.
Yeah.
You just really like
These
them.
are great examples, I think, and we've talked about this now before, of these examples that are seemingly so endearing, and yet all of those, if you actually think about them, they're kind of horrible.
Yeah, he's coming from his girlfriend's house and he sits down and plays Nintendo with AJ.
And covers his eyes and cheats.
Yeah.
Also, very important, most important part of this particular podcast. You cannot play Nintendo 64 by just moving the directional pad.
No,
that would not work.
He was using the joystick.
Also, he just sits down and says he wants to play with AJ, and then AJ's playing a one-player game. Now they're playing a two-player game. This is huge plot holes, inconsistencies.
How did they do it?
This is a huge problem. I was very upset.
Yeah,
it's
upsetting.
Is so far in The Sopranos probably my biggest disappointment.
Yeah, my other disappointment this episode.
Yes. As somebody who grew up in the 90s, that was very upsetting.
Yeah, I do like all the mushroom cuts that I see at AJ's school.
There's some great cuts.
I was in middle and high school in the 90s / early 2000s. And every item of clothing that I see Meadow wear or that I see like the kids in the schools wear when we do see them, I'm like, I wore that.
Right.
For me, it's very nostalgic. And that's why maybe in some ways, like, it doesn't have a feeling of being an old show. It just feels very real to me. Like, oh yeah, that's what high school looks like, because that's how it looked when I was in high school, right?
Yeah, so we might be a little dated on that.
But anyways, to go back to the one moment that felt, besides the Nintendo 64, it was obviously very upsetting. The one scene, and this may be one of the only times this happens in this show, I'll try to keep track of them, but the one scene I didn't find believable was when Melfi started talking about her experience with Randall getting beat up. We just talked last week about kind of the believability of the female characters in this show as compared to other shows. And that was a moment where I was like, I don't think Melfi would really do this.
Perhaps not. And yet, I think it also speaks to
Tony's
the duress that people are under when they're dealing with this post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
She's talking to her, you're better named, Randall? Randall. Okay. I thought it was Randall. She's talking to him about going to seek counsel from a post-traumatic stress counselor. People are clearly responding to that kind of stress in their life and that kind of toxicity stemming from Tony in different ways, and they don't really know how to deal with it, and typically it kind of veers their life a little bit off course. And I think that happens to Melfi.
Well, we see it in later seasons when, other terrible things happen to Melfi. But it just seemed, I didn't feel like we were there yet with her in her relationship with Tony, that she would kind of veer so much from her professional role. But I also like, that is, we see her later talking to her own therapist, who's only mentioned here. What's his name? Elliot Kupferberg. And so he's mentioned here. We see her later really talking about how challenging this therapeutic relationship that she has with Tony is.
Yeah.
So and it's put her out of her professional.
Yeah.
Like her regular professional self. It's something that's kind of different.
And it does introduce this topic for her, which she brings up, which she calls casual violence. And actually, it stems from that scene starts. Tony's talking about the first time I saw a dead body very nonchalantly. We just kind of start the scene there. Yeah. That's where he is in the session. And in some ways I can see these things are linked, and the conversation is leading there, the topics are leading there, and Melfi is engaging in the topic and has been affected by this casual violence. The Soprano world is kind of closed in on her a little bit, and this is her responding to that. Is it the most professional? No. But perhaps it is believable that she just doesn't know how to respond to it, and this is what happens.
In some ways, we even see it in Tony's dream. Like, her office is full of, Tony and AJ, and then all these other mob guys. And the mob guys are in her hallway, right? We see that Silvio's dentist is across the hall.
Yeah. Yeah. What about the introduction of these kind of seaside themes? We see all throughout the episode these kind of ocean-related objects and names. I know. It's interesting. So many. We have when they go see Brendan, there's this boat show going on. We have when he goes to Corrado's outside is ocean and sea view. We have the first thing that Jackie says in the hospital is, I've got a fish in my pocket.
Yeah, the picture of Tony and AJ and the fish.
And the fish, yeah, definitely. For me, the picture of AJ, Tony, and the fish is kind of what did kind of bring some clarity to it. I think, especially outside Corrado's restaurant where they have this sit-down.
It's called the sit-tight.
The sit-tight, I know.
Sit-tight loungeonette.
Yeah, we start to have this relationship between the mob and that world and these kind of ocean themes, these kind of sea topics. So when you have AJ looking at this picture of him and his dad and this, what he thought of as this kind of loving, moment that he's reflecting on, again, these kind of seemingly humanizing portraits of Tony, there's something behind it, and there's something that seems so weird now when we look at that big fish. Actually, they've established the fish and these ocean creatures as something that's actually associated with the violence in the mob world.
And we definitely see that come later.
Yeah.
And, sleeping with the fishes.
Sleeping with the fishes. Well, actually, even I noticed when they go to the website, it
Yeah.
actually says on that front page, like, John
shit.
Gaudian is, like, sleeping with the
Oh,
fishes.
shit.
There's so many things that are related to
That's crazy.
the ocean.
Well, it links
Yeah.
back to Meadowlands, the title of the
Yeah.
episode, right? Because we've driven through there. We've never stopped
beautiful.
there.
It's wonderful.
It's, you don't stop in Meadowlands because it's just this, like, swampy, disgusting, like, polluted area.
Yeah.
But apparently that is somewhere where there's lots of bodies to be found.
Right.
So,
And,
again, fish maybe live there. I don't know.
Yeah,
But definitely.
something pastoral sounding too, but on
It's such
deeper
inspection. Yeah,
not so much.
The title is a weird one because, of course, I don't know. I always try to feel like it should be connected somehow to Meadow. I haven't been able to make that work. It's a lot that her name is Meadow and the title is Meadowlands. We see her so briefly.
Yeah.
In
And
this
yet,
episode.
great performance by her.
Great
in
performance. And we see her a lot in next week's episode. So,
She's the one, though, who kind of directs AJ to this knowledge.
Well, she clearly has it, right? We see that in the scene with Chris when he picks her up at school and she's like, another FBI raid. Like, she's used to this. Like, she's old enough. They're that much older than AJ that she gets it, right? She knows why the kids are, like, laughing at AJ and saying he's scared of you, So she's wise to it, and she directs AJ to that wonderful website.
Yeah.
But anyways, but that's so, like, again, with this seaside imagery, water, fish.
Yeah.
That's something definitely that comes up again and again, so we'll just have to keep paying
Well, that
attention.
we'll definitely be seeing more of that. Also, the song at the end of this episode during the credits, look on down from the bridge.
Right. Well, and last time we watched this, you were pretty obsessed with the bridges.
There's a lot of bridges.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of bridges. And I think that having that song come in during this funeral, we're definitely linking bridges to death. There's something also interesting about it. I've been thinking, we live in New York and been going through Jersey occasionally.
To go to Holston's.
We've gone to Holston's. My last Holston's run wasn't that long ago. And anyway. I just got distracted. We went to Holston's, which is where the last scene of the show happens, and we were going as big Sopranos fans, but it's kind of an amazing place in Bloomfield, I believe, which actually I guess referenced in this episode.
That's true. Wow. The casino.
Deep.
Super deep. Now I'm really distracted.
Yeah.
Onion rings.
Yeah, the onion rings, best in the state. Okay, we got to get on focus. The ice cream's distracting. But anyway, traveling through New Jersey, I do think that even outside of the metaphorical side of bridges, there's something about the imagery that's just so... It just kind of sums up this show, but it also kind of sums up New Jersey for me or something. It's just like, it's just a look. When you're traveling through those parts of New Jersey, it's kind of overwhelming.
It's industrial.
There's so many bridges going everywhere. It really just does kind of have this visual feel to it.
But we see a lot of key scenes happen on bridges too. Not in this episode per se, but we saw one in, is it episode 2?
Yeah, maybe the first episode actually, where they're threatening.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we see another one later this season with our friend Vindicasian, who we haven't talked about yet. But
yeah.
I think they're of importance. We see a lot of scenes throughout the series that David Chase clearly put in front of a bridge for a reason. We often see them like behind Tony.
Yeah. It's definitely a deliberate symbol.
Yeah. But we'll pay attention. And I don't know if we had it figured out on our last viewing, but maybe...
Well, yeah, we'll continue visiting it as they're introduced throughout the episodes.
Yeah.
But there's definitely an aspect of...
But they have to do with water, too.
There's also something, though, about these... Traveling through New Jersey and seeing this industry on these kind of like wide open land spaces that's basically all highway, bridges, and factories. I feel like these were things that were built during a different generation, and they've been kind of run down. And I think that that's something that we're seeing coming in at the end. It's better to be in at the beginning. the show is looking at the degradation of this community
something that
of
would have
America
been
on the whole.
industrious.
Yeah.
And now we look at it as kind of this like ugly industrial.
Yeah. And
area.
infrastructure, maybe even investing in infrastructure as a society and basically just letting it rot.
Yeah. No, I like that. Kind of like how we see with the cathedral building and things like that
Exactly.
too, which was maybe even a generation before that in some ways.
Yeah.
I like it.
Exactly.
Can we talk a little bit about Vin Makazian? Because
Yeah.
I forgot that he's only in season 1. I think he makes like a
Yeah.
dream appearance later on. Don't we see him? We see him in a dream, I think.
It's crazy how many new characters come in this
know.
episode. I mean, we have Jimmy Altieri, Ray Curto.
Yeah,
we
that
have
other guy.
Makazian.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to hear them talk about Urkel DeMeo.
Yeah.
The
old guy.
the actual boss of the family,
Yeah.
who kind of is shrouded in mystery.
We never. I think we
never?
see maybe like a video clip of him or something like that at some point. I'll have to
If
track it.
even.
But yeah, he's a mystery, right?
Yeah.
Like we're kind of led into this family in a really interesting way where it's
Kinda just
at
dropped
first we
in.
think Tony's the boss, right?
Yeah.
Then we realize there's this guy Jackie who's the boss, but now he's dead.
Yeah.
And who's the
Very
boss of him? We hear it in
disorienting.
this in this news clip, right?
Yeah.
We're not told this information. They reference the old guy.
Yeah.
They talk about New York vaguely,
Yeah.
but we don't really get it. Yeah, and it's funny, like, in terms of like looking back on those golden era times or whatever it might be, right? Where this DeMeo guy would have been the actual boss in real life. I love when we go to the sit tight loungeonette.
Mm-hmm.
It is such an old timey looking place.
Yeah.
And we go in and Junior's sitting there with two guys who the camera never focuses on. We focus
Yeah.
on one guy's fedora really clearly. And the other guy is also wearing something old timey. I'm not sure. And they're not even speaking, right? We only hear Junior speak. And
Right.
so they're kind of these almost like ghostly creatures too. Like, who the fuck are they? Like, how are they related to Junior?
Yeah.
Are they his are they
Yeah.
his captains? Like,
Yeah.
who are those guys?
I know. We kind of see
We
their
see the
reaction.
muscle guy in the background. We know
Yeah.
he's some kind
Well,
of
and we
muscle.
see after Tony and Junior in the end of the episode kind of make up on this conflict, we see them being happy in the back
Yeah.
and responding
Yeah.
to the drama unfolding.
They're clearly related.
they're so
somehow.
peripheral.
Yeah, but it's kind of like that. This was totally a different era, right? Where they sit around and have lunch. When we see Tony and his guys doing it, we see a scene. Actually, I think it's kind of close. And no, he leaves the Bing and then he goes there. We see him eating lobster with all those guys at
Again,
the Bing.
lobster, right?
Lobster is such an ocean food. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, but I think it is that kind of like we were saying with the bridges and the industry too. It's like from this time past that
Yeah.
you could never create something like the sit tight loungeonette
No.
anymore, and you would never have some dude with a fedora sitting there eating lunch with you.
Right.
It's this kind of I think it was it Sopranos Autopsy we were reading, which we love if we haven't mentioned that before.
We have. But we do love it.
But we love it.
Yeah.
They talk about that it's I forget how he put it. He's an amazing writer, but something about it being like about how the past is a time that we can romanticize it and we remember it in some ways, but we can never go back to it.
Yeah.
We're always revisiting it within our own time,
Yeah.
right? And within our own kind of like values of the
Yeah.
time. So when we see these characters who are like struggling to move forward from olden days, which we see Junior a lot, right? Like he wants to run the mob like the mob used to be run.
Yeah.
Now that he's boss. But you can't ever go back to that. You always, it's this kind of ghost that you can't really see or visit. So
Yeah.
I don't know, forget exactly what he said, but I want to talk about Makazian, if that's okay.
Please.
The writing in this show is just like so tight. It's so good.
Yeah, it's
and
incredible.
so we see this guy peeing. Okay.
This is first scene.
I think that scene, I wanted to go back actually and like time that scene. I think the scene is probably under a minute.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah. I would say so
and
for sure.
we know just based on this dialogue that doesn't come outright and say anything, like we know he's a cop because Tony says like, oh, you want us to go down to the station and have a meeting there, right? We get all this information on this dude. We know what kind of character he is. He has 2 alimonies to pay.
Yeah. Later on in the episode, he's saying, "What should I put my money on for the big game?"
Yeah.
These throwaway lines that in any other show would be meaningless or just kind of filler. But later on, that actually is related to the drama and the relationships and the plot development.
Yeah.
So nothing's wasted.
Yeah, but we're thrown into this like old relationship that he and Tony have clearly had over time. But we're also, so we have 2 scenes, or no, we don't have 2 scenes with him. We have 2 scenes with him and Tony. We have when they're setting up this Melfi following, and then we have when they're in that industrial space and he's like filling in Tony on what he found out. And in that scene where he's telling Tony about what he found out and says that thing about the bet that he should place his money on, Tony is disgusted with him. Like, Tony thinks that guy is scum. Yeah. And I feel like he says that in later episodes. I'll have to, again, pay attention to that. But Tony looks at him with this look of just, like, disgust. Which, again, is one of those things that's really funny because Tony's arguably maybe a way more disgusting person. Right? Or not.
Does have a more negative impact on more people.
On people, but this look he gives them is so, and he's disheveled and he's sweaty, and Tony comes across as very powerful, and
I think he calls him a fucking idiot under his breath in Melfi's session near the end when she's describing what happens.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, but he's clearly like disgusted by him, and I know that Tony does have a thing against gamblers, right? That's one thing. Yeah. And now he owns this. Well, he has this casino in his portfolio or whatever you want to call it.
That's an interesting evolution.
Right. And
also seeing Tony's relationship with gambling throughout the entire course of the series.
Anyways, I wanted to talk about Mackenzie and we'll follow him to the end of this season.
Yeah. Very efficient
so
writing.
Efficient writing. Like I was just blown away by it.
And believable. Believable
totally
dialogue.
Believable.
Amazing.
Yeah.
What would you like to do next? There's a lot to talk about.
I know. Shoot. I thought we didn't have as much this week.
No, there always is. This has happened now. You feel like there's not a lot in this show.
We were going to come back to, you mentioned the whole concept of anticlimax. And I
feel like that's a huge part of this episode.
Yeah, I do want to focus in on that.
And this show.
I mean, we'll come to some great quotes later on as we watch, but that whole concept of everything being a big nothing. Yeah. And I don't know. The anticlimax thing is really, I think, is incredible in this episode. Well, it's incredible in, I think, David Chase's work that he really does show. We've talked about this already in a couple of episodes. Like, he really does write believable characters, and he really does show real life. And so real life doesn't always have a climax.
In fact, it typically doesn't.
Right? And so I think that's, like, real life isn't fiction. Real life isn't a story. And he writes these characters so realistically that we almost feel like, I don't know, it's these portrayals of very real characters that go through real life. And I think that's why it's a show that speaks to so many people. Yeah. But we see the anticlimax in, multiple different ways in this episode.
Well, I feel like there's like 2 main narratives in this episode. And I think that they mirror each other. And they're supposed to mirror each other. There's kind of symmetry to Tony and Junior's conflict, and Tony and,
Anthony and AJ Jeremy. And Jeremy. Yeah.
AJ and Jeremy. So I feel like both of those are kind of unfolding the same way. We have this issue that kind of exists between them, and how do they resolve it? And both of them end up in a place that nobody would have really expected. From watching a show like this on first glance, you would kind of think that this would unfold in a traditional kind of Hollywood blockbuster way with fireworks and fights and
going to the
a
mattresses.
Clear winner, going to the mattresses, which I think is even referenced. It is referenced in this.
They say nobody Ray Curto says that.
That nobody goes to the mattresses these days. And at the end of this episode, you have Tony basically just surrendering to Junior, at least. Even though
he comes in heavy, but he doesn't want to.
He comes in heavy, he doesn't want to, and really he has a plan, but it's not a climactic ending to that conflict. And then with AJ, we have, him just receiving $40, and I think nothing sums it up more than the awkward clapping at the end and somebody just saying boo. That was amazing.
Yeah.
I loved that. Also love the humor in the show and the kind of
It's
subtle
amazing,
moments
I
like
know.
that. But I think that kind of sums it up. There's not a climax to all these narratives, and that's kind of where a lot of this leads. We're expecting something, and David Chase loves to play with that. He loves to bring it somewhere that is a lot less than we expected.
Yeah, but that in a way almost, like, it almost trips up your, I don't know what the right word I'm looking for is, like, it disorients you
It
in
does.
such a way because you're kind of building up your own adrenaline towards, even though we know it was going to happen, right? But you still do, like, he's so good at building up that sense of anxiety
Yeah.
and like dread and whatever, and so you're waiting for that release and you don't really get it, and
Yeah.
the way that you do get it in kind of disorients you and doesn't satisfy you. It puts you off in the best way,
Yeah. It's
in
amazing.
such a cool way.
There were some interesting things they did to link, I think, those two narratives that were going on. One thing that I thought was really interesting is they have Tony beating up Mikey, and they have we have this exact same sound effects as when we have AJ and Jeremy fighting, punching each
Interesting.
other.
Yeah.
These kind of super overdone punching noises, but again, they evoke each other.
Yeah.
There's definitely
It
a
was like
parallel between them.
like an old Batman cartoon,
Yeah.
you know, when they're like pow.
Yeah, but exactly. But even the way that those two things unfold, we kind of see them unfolding the same way. Also, like a tendency to resort to violence. I thought it was interesting. I thought it tied into Tony playing this game with his son and kind of covering his eyes, and there's something almost violent about it for me. It's kind of aggressive. He's, kind of covering his eyes and really kind of dominating. One thing actually I thought was interesting there too is in the back of that room, even this, again, a seemingly endearing, humanizing moment, we see a Mario Puzo book, the author of The Godfather, on the table. So for me, again, it's like any of these domestic moments and these family moments are inseparable from what's happening in his other life. He has two families, and you can never have a moment of domestic bliss. It's impossible. There's always something of the mob coming in. And violence is, of course, it's going to come into AJ's life.
Yeah.
And of course it came into Tony's life, and a central question of the show is, could he have escaped it? And it's complicated, but there's all these forces acting on these characters to turn them into a certain type of person. And we start to see that there's a lot of pressure and a lot of forces moving towards turning AJ into a violent person.
Yeah. I think Carmela captures it actually in a interesting way when she's so focused on with Tony's therapy, like, do you talk about our marriage? Do you and she says it a bunch of times when he's really dealing with the other family in his therapy, even though maybe he should be dealing with his biological family in some ways.
Yeah.
But I thought, like, that's a kind of a way that tied those two things together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, too, in this episode, we have Tony thinking of leaving therapy and then getting ideas for that. He's going there, ostensibly, for help and counseling on his family life, but he receives advice and ideas for how to better act within the mob family.
Better manipulate, yeah.
Yeah, how to better manipulate. And that actually, at the end, he talks about, it's going great for coping. He kind of throws that in, but clearly he's using this for, not the best ends.
Yeah.
What do you think? What else? I definitely have some stray observations.
Sure, let's do it.
Well, let's see. We have, again, I was talking about the kind of connection of Christopher saying, don't ever say that. God's kind of going over the line. And we have Livia with her malcontent with life. And we also have Tony talking to Vin Makazian about one of his first lines to him is he's asking, are you bored with your life? So I guess
boredom is big in this show, too.
Boredom's big. And I think that idea of, like, how do you live your life? And there's an aspect of this mundane. There's a mundane aspect to it. And there's questions of purpose, questions of lack of purpose in a lot of people's lives, and what does it mean, and boredom. And as entertaining as the show is, there is this kind of way that things are put together that is kind of very bleak.
Yeah.
and very sparse.
Well, I love like when Tony has his panic attack, right? You'd think it was going to be, I don't know, at some other key moment, but he has it after
It's only some apple juice.
He brings in some groceries and puts some apple juice away, and then he falls over.
Clear framing of greenery and nature outside in
Yeah.
that scene. We see his windows, looking into his backyard, looking at trees.
Yeah.
It's very kind of...
Well, then that's after the scene where he's getting this bug killer or whatever.
Yeah.
Too. But then we also see that this, in terms of this mundane, like when Tony has Makazian follow Melfi, the way he describes her life, like, and she describes her own life in a similar way when she's recounting this story to Tony later.
Yeah.
But he's like, yeah, she gets to the office at 8, she leaves at 6, she orders a Diet Coke and tuna sub. And then later she says the same thing. She's like, I feel like I'm out of touch. I just like come to the office and live this life. So.
Yeah.
But I think boredom gets to be a bigger theme, maybe in even the later seasons.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think so. We have really fascinating in Tony and Carmela's, not a ton of interaction between them in this episode, but Carmela interpreting or just basically stating assuming that the psychiatrist is a man.
Yeah.
And what I loved about that is it goes a few times, and for us as viewers, it's uncomfortable, but Tony doesn't correct her. But it's also...
But we see...
He also just had a panic attack. It's not really... He's disoriented, and he doesn't go out of his way to deceive her. But she says it a few times, and they really establish that. And then he says he.
Yeah.
So he acknowledges that.
You see his face.
He crosses the line there. He deliberately deceives.
Yeah.
And obviously that's going to come back to be an issue.
Yeah.
But it's just really interesting to see the writing and to see how that scene unfolds, and to see also Tony cross that line. Because for a moment, he's not a great guy, but at least he doesn't cross that line.
Yeah.
Of deliberately manipulating.
Misleading or whatever.
Misleading. Yeah. Again, in this, I feel like there's in these parallels between the AJ and the Tony storylines, there's this kind of like infantile aspect of the conflicts. We have, you were saying, like
childish, yeah.
Very childish, and we have, Junior acting and Livia acting, they're being like kids. And that's what Melfi says. She says they're like kids, and she talks about giving them the illusion of being in control. And that ends up being what holds him back from quitting psychiatry, because it's this idea that he then uses. But he's essentially using a strategy to manipulate children. Yeah. But everybody's kind of acting like a child here.
Well, I say that all the time in my teaching, right?
Sometimes I catch you, I think, using your childhood techniques on me.
Yeah, I used to teach preschool, and I use the same tactics on adults all the time. It's easy.
It's pretty successful.
Easy psychiatry. The one thing I forgot to say when we were talking more about Junior, but I think it's relevant too. There's this one line, and I think it's Jimmy, who I love how they don't tell us anyone's name. Like, you just have to know their names, these people. And,
yeah,
like, we only find them out later. But I think it's Jimmy who says about Junior when they're at the Bing and they're talking about who's going to succeed. He says, or maybe it's Ray Curto, actually, to be honest, but he says, oh yeah, Junior, he's living in the wrong century. You know it, and New York knows it.
Right.
And that's also like one of the first times we hear about New York, right? We have interestingly, Livia earlier in the episode, there's like this trip to New York, and she has all these negative feelings about New York, which I imagine she would have been exposed to the New York crew when she was younger, or when Johnny Boy was still alive.
Probably.
But she has these weird, like, she's like, men defecating themselves and women throwing babies out of windows, and she has all the, like, this is what she thinks of New York, but we clearly see that there's
I mean, we live in New York, and I do see that all the time.
Maybe the
I threw
first
a few babies out of a window today, and we just we had a little party with our neighbors. We just threw some window babies.
But I like that difference, and I mean, we're not native New Yorkers, but there is this kind of tension between New York and New Jersey, right?
Right.
Like, I think New Jersey...
Ooh, here you go. You got to be careful.
Sucks.
Oh, no.
But that's okay. To each their own. But there is this tension. And people who live in these nice houses in New Jersey think that my life sucks.
Right.
And it's all about your perspective, right? And that's the cool thing about, like I said, I think maybe last week, this show... is that it is, like, perspective is so important, right? And so we get these glimpses into how other people see things.
Totally.
in the show as well. I'm
Totally.
sorry, New Jersey. I think you're okay.
Yeah? You think so? Yeah. Oh.
What else?
Sorry if you're from New Jersey. I love in the Bada Bing, there's these kind of like surreal, kind of like polar opposite matchings of things that are just kind of like very off-putting for me. We have Tony in this strip club reading a book on elder care.
Yeah.
You know, we have Christopher walking in on this really solemn moment. We have, you know, the dancer saying, "I'll never forget where I was on this day."
And then she's back to dancing like a
stark
second
contrast.
later. Yeah.
I think also Christopher, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he talks about we should be going to DEF CON 4. I think he has that backwards.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's really interesting, this kind of the backwards and this kind of like weird pairings. What else? Do you have some observations? Some things?
I think I kind of got all my observations, actually. I was trying to be more concise.
Okay. I loved, I'm trying to think, small things. There was a great scene where Tony grabs the staple gun, and we have it, and he's in the hospital, and you have this kind of like X cross of these bars, and you just see the legs of the construction worker. But it's a great, even just the composition of that shot, the X draws your attention to that staple gun, even if you're not thinking about it. And then, of course, he takes it and uses it to great effect.
Yeah, I love how we don't see Mikey for the rest of that episode. We just he's talked about, but he's not at the funeral. At least we don't see him at the funeral. He just gets mentioned like, "Oh, Mikey, something." I know we see him later on, but
but that casual violence is definitely a part of this show and part of their lives.
Crazy.
Well, I think we were talking about how we thought there wasn't that much to talk about in this episode, and I think we've maybe even done the longest one. It seems like there just seems to be more and more
we gotta wrap
talk
it
about
up
as time goes on. All right, wrap it up. But this is in at the end. This was fun. We're very excited for next week, next episode, College. Possibly one of the greatest Soprano episodes.
We'll see after we watch it.
I mean, they're all incredible episodes. They're all great episodes, but there's something about that one.
That one stands out.
It seems like the first masterpiece.
It's the one, well, we'll talk about it next week, but it's the one where they really, I think, at least for me, hammer home the two families thing.
Yeah.
And it's so good.
It's just a brilliant narrative.
Yeah.
In this
Okay, we'll talk about it next week.
Okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves.
And at the end, see you later.
See you later.